Nuestro invitado de hoy se crió en un barrio obrero de Inglaterra. Fue ateo a los 14, marxista a los 16 y trotskista a los 19. Periodista y escritor de prestigio, hoy es uno de los pensadores que susurra al oído de Jeremy Corbyn. En Otra Vuelta de Tuerka, Paul Mason. Paul Mason, bienvenido a Otra Vuelta de Tuerka.
It's great to be here.
En este programa nos gusta mucho el psicoanálisis y siempre empezamos por la infancia de los invitados. Naciste en una ciudad obrera, tu madre era profesora, tu padre era camionero. ¿Qué recuerdos tienes de tu primera infancia?
I loved my childhood. We lived in a community that had seen rising real wages, great social cohesion, and there was actually a deal between capital and labour. And life got better for people, and not just materially better, culturally better. If you watch the movies about working class England in the 1960s, after all, this is the culture that produced the Beatles. You see educated young people who can see the future. And if we're into psychoanalysis, I will only say I lived to see that society destroyed. And all the bad feelings I have in my life are about the way in which it was destroyed and the cruelty with which Margaret Thatcher chose to disperse that culture, because capital could no longer live with the social power and cultural confidence of the working class people I grew up with. Last year, I went back to my town to campaign in the general election for Labour, and a small crowd came to meet me of disabled people, of grey-haired people, people suffering from diseases of poverty, alcoholism. And I thought, this is an old bunch of people. They were the exact age that I am. They were my exact contemporaries. What has neoliberalism did to that town was destroyed its well-being. And that's what gives me the motivation to change things.
He leído que a los 14 años ya te considerabas ateo, a los 16 marxista y a los 19 incluso trotskista. Entiendo que el thatcherismo de alguna forma empujó tu evolución ideológica.
Look, it's quite easy to become an atheist if you go to a Catholic school. And quite easy to become a Marxist too, because though I would still describe myself as a Marxist, I would think of myself as a humanist Marxist. And I now understand, which I didn't understand then, Marxism as a product of the Enlightenment, of scientific thinking about human beings, which in itself was only an extension of Judeo-Christian morality. So now I understand that. Then I was very angry. And it wasn't Thatcherism. I became radicalized by the late crisis of what we call the Keynesian era, the era that designed by John Maynard Keynes. By the time I'm 13, my dad is occupying not just the factory, but the union office which will not support the occupation of the factory. Okay. All around me is graffiti on the walls against fascism, which we thought fascism was dead. And we had a government, there was a strike in 1973 in Britain where the government switched the lights off for 3 days a week. So my teenage years were a crisis years. And the crazy thing is that an old form of leftism, very hierarchical, very dedicated to class struggle, which after 1968, people thought, well, that too is old-fashioned. This became very relevant because suddenly we are facing a state that wants to destroy us. And many people like me drew the conclusion that the only way to fight this state is to fight it head to head with the same hierarchical methods, which we learned very easily from the old Progress publisher books from Moscow, how to do this. I don't regret that, but I have moved on from it because the kind of struggle that was launched on the May 15th by you and your colleagues, which we have done in the London Stock Exchange occupation, and before that against climate change, and at Genoa, at Seattle, in Prague. I learned a new kind of politics. I learned it quite the hard way by seeing my old ideas fail to explain stuff. But yeah, in my teenage years, a whole generation like me were created who became real hard leftists because we were faced with the kind of dispersal of a community. And that, I would say, I'm in my late 50s now, there are many people with me now in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party who have gone through the exact same experience.
Hay algo en tu vida que me interesa especialmente y es el papel que juega la música a la hora de configurar tu personalidad y tu estilo. Háblame de eso.
Okay, so I have two musical backgrounds. My dad, I think my dad could read music better than he could read words. He was a miner who became a truck driver, and he came from a non-literate family. Okay, literally a family whose defense against authority was when they received a letter through the door to throw it into the fire unread. That's the proletarian culture my dad came from. So for him, music was incredibly important, as it was the culture. And we have, as you have in Spain, I've seen an Andalusian brass band. We have similar, but we play classical music. So to learn the trombone, as my dad did, was a route to understanding classical music and also jazz. But my mother's family, who are the Jewish side of the family, they had been musicians. They came from Poland or Lithuania, we don't know. They were musicians. So I felt music in my bloodstream. And music to me is the human personality taking a walk with no destination. It's pure freedom. When I'm improvising, or even when I'm listening to the music I like, I feel so free that I'm so glad that I had the access to the culture to understand this, to be able to switch on a Schumann Lieder or a Wagner opera, and to understand that this is a whole world of freedom and potential freedom being created for me as a human being. And then I look around me at the children growing up in the town I came from. Those children have no access to that. Neoliberalism has reduced everything to commodity, and for them to spend 1 hour a day studying a musical instrument is a waste of time. Even if there is money to provide the musical instrument, which no longer exists, it's a waste of time as far as commodity capitalism is concerned. They would be better off studying mathematics so they become a computer programmer. So that's the role music still plays in my life. I still, if I want to go somewhere to escape the bullshit around us, I go to music. Although I don't want to escape it, I want to confront it and defeat it.
Te quiero preguntar por tu primera experiencia en medios de comunicación muy importantes. Trabajaste para la BBC, para Channel 4, para The Guardian. ¿Cómo es esa primera experiencia de trabajar en medios de comunicación muy prestigiosos, pero al mismo tiempo muy mainstream?
Well, obviously, I had to fight my way into the media. I was a musicologist until 30, and then I decided to become a journalist. And you can talk your way in an Anglo-Saxon society. It's not about qualification. It's about, can you really talk your way into the job? And I talked my way into the bottom of journalism and worked up for 10 years. And it just happened that the BBC wanted business reporters, and that's what I was. And I went in. But it was obvious that because I had a big political hinterland, that I was going to bring more to the reporting of business than mere kind of, that, you know, there's a classic guy with a suit who just says the stock market went up, went down. I wasn't going to do that. And the first live video I did, the live performance on BBC Newsnight, was 9/11. And I was sitting in the office and we see the planes go in, and yeah, for sure, the anti-terror reporters, the guys with the contacts inside the Secret Service, they knew immediately what had gone on. But nobody knew. I knew, for example, which companies were in the building. And so suddenly I'm on that. And from then, immediately, Enron is almost immediately the problem with Enron. And then Argentina. If you remember, late 2001 was a triple crisis. And because I've studied political economy, because I understood and hopefully understand the political economy of a crisis, you know, I was surrounded by people who kept saying things will soon go back to normal. And I was able to say, no, now you're in a new situation. I think this was what allowed me to make the break into the mainstream media, because it was clear to the people around me that I had a leftist background, that in a way it was a mistake to hire me, because they don't hire leftists. But because I hope I did the job okay and won many awards, I was able to, of course, for 5-6 years you're struggling, but then the world exploded, 2008, and everybody said, you're right. So then I think the authority that I had there was enabled me to say with more confidence what I thought was going on. I felt much freer after that. And indeed, I think once I started covering the social unrest in late 2010, early 2011, that led to M15, led to Occupy. It started with us in 2010 with the student occupation. And, you know, I could tell with authority. I said to my colleagues, look, when the students clashed with our riot police, and the riot police were the last line of defence against Parliament, I said to them, I was on the miners' demo that was here 30 years ago, and the fight, the level of intention among those students is higher than it was among the miners. They really mean to change the world. Okay, that's interesting.
Una de las consecuencias políticas de esa crisis mundial que empieza en 2008 tiene que ver con el cambio en los sistemas políticos europeos. Y Grecia, inmediatamente, como uno de los países más afectados por la crisis, se convierte en uno de los países donde puede haber un cambio político radical. Tú tienes un trabajo espectacular, This is a Coup, en el que hablas, digamos, de todo el proceso que se vive en Grecia. Te quiero preguntar por ese primer momento, lo comentábamos antes off the record, el momento de la canción de Leonard Cohen, First we take Manhattan, then we take Berlin, que es el momento en el que en 2015, en el mes de enero, Alexis Tsipras y Syriza gana las elecciones y de repente parece que pueden cambiar algunas cosas. ¿Qué recuerdas de aquel momento?
Look, This is a Coup was made with a director called Theopis Skarlatos, who deserves the credit for that movie. It is, I'm the proudest I've ever been of a piece of work. But what we did, I had a day-to-day job as a news reporter. I helped raise the money and sent Theopi and many other very poorly paid leftist journalists all over Greece during the election campaign, January 2015. They get to a village. The village has never seen campaigning because it's patriarchally owned by one of the parties. It doesn't matter which. There are no posters. There's no campaign. And yet Syriza is there. And the peasants say, nobody cares about us, but these guys arrived, so we're going to vote for them. There was no tradition of leftism in this village. That's where when I'm seeing the rushes coming back to the edit, I say, okay, something big's going to happen. Even if they only win by a slight amount, and they didn't win, remember they had to form a coalition with a nationalist party. Yep. This is going to change. They're serious. And we started in London to make contacts. I facilitated contacts between Syriza and the financial elite to try and allow Syriza to explain what the limits of its intentions were. So we knew it was serious, and then in those days before the election, I remember standing just below you. You were on the platform with Tsipras, and you said, first we take Manhattan, then we take Berlin.
Thank you. First, we take Manhattan, then we take Berlin.
I turned to a guy who's since has become a Syriza MP, and I said, you know, are you happy? He says, I was in the effing Polytechnic. I was in a student uprising in 1973 against the dictatorship. How happy do you think I am? I now see that moment as very significant because the European elite had the chance to see the future. Here's you, a progressive, socially liberal guy with a following, with no intention of overthrowing the system, but of reforming it. And Tsipras is the same. And they said, no thanks. Okay.
They did whatever they did to me, to us, to Greece, not only because they didn't like us, but just because they didn't want to have a domino effect in other European countries.
And then they smashed Syriza. Now what do they get? Viktor Orban, Vox, Salvini, AfD in Germany, Kurz and the fascists in Austria. That's the payback. For that moment of refusal of Greece, smashing Greek democracy, we will look back on that moment with great regret.
Para nosotros, aquellos momentos fueron enormemente duros porque nos vimos frente a algo que habíamos estudiado pero que no habíamos vivido, que era la correlación de fuerzas. Y efectivamente, lo que inicialmente podía parecer una amenaza del gobierno griego, el plan B, nos vamos del euro, se convirtió en el plan A de Alemania y de la Troika. Os echamos nosotros. ¿Piensas que el gobierno griego tenía una estrategia, digamos, adecuada para negociar con la Troika o era imposible que las cosas hubieran podido ocurrir de otra forma?
I think it was possible to have achieved a different outcome, but what we didn't know in January 2015 is how far the European Union would go. And all the signals were coming from Renzi, from Hollande, from, in the back channels, even members of the Commission, that if you compromise a bit, there will be some debt relief, some restructuring. We can't give you everything, but we can give you something. Now, in other words, the real drama wasn't in Athens. The real drama was between Paris, Rome, and Berlin. And what happened? I think Germany seized control of the situation. Now, as an English guy who grew up with people who fought in World War II, I'm very careful about saying bad things about Germany. You know, and at my funeral, most of the music will be German. You know, but you have to understand that what the German elite did and is still doing is gaming the Eurozone to produce 4% unemployment in Germany and 25% unemployment across the South. That's the system. And when you speak to the honest members of the German elite, that's what they admit. Now, we didn't know whether this was an absolute thing. Remember, Schäuble in the last moment, when we are texting from this is a coup, on that night of the defeat, Schäuble is producing on the back of an envelope a plan to kick Greece out of the euro, which is meant to be impossible. So I think a better tactic would have been to struggle early, to pull the trigger early. You know, I was there, I was in the Maximum Mansion filming when they decided to not pay the IMF, and it was too late. And we interviewed Tsipras, and in a retrospect, he said too late.
You do differently?
I think that we lost time. And at the end, we were out of force and out of money. If we knew that, we could make more brave decisions at the beginning.
But there's another thing, and we should remember it because we have a nominally left government in Spain now, and I hope one day the left will rule Spain, that when it does, if you're trapped in an international system like the Euro system, that there's nothing the masses can do. The masses used to say, anarchists or real activists who had no intention of ever being in Parliament said, look, our problem is we're ready to struggle right now. But even if we overthrew the government, that's not the solution. The solution is we need to change the European system, and we have no way of doing it. And so the result then was that the masses were demobilized. I felt that the organic connection between Syriza as a party and its mass base fell apart. And then here's the most honest thing. In the last few hours, the last few days of that struggle, when everybody is starving, the banks are closed, we said to each other, we looked each other in the eye, can you do the Athenian commune? Can you take over the medicines, the hospitals, the transport system, and run it without capitalism? And some said yes, and a lot said no. And the ones who said no were actually correct. That's why 2 days after the defeat, I did a lecture in Athens, and it was a really angry crowd. And I opened by saying, welcome to Stalingrad. You've retreated 2,000 kilometers to survive, and your back is to the river, but the war isn't over. And I just believe for the last 3 years, they've been in Stalingrad, in that sense.
Esta pregunta es un poco difícil. Si tú hubieras podido ser asesor del gobierno griego, después del referéndum del no y la última negociación que termina en la aplicación de un paquete de ajuste, ¿qué hubieras recomendado hacer a Alexis Tsipras?
Step back. First of all, I would have recommended Varoufakis to stay in the government. Yeah? He didn't just leave. He could have left and then launched a revolt. He left and then left. I saw him leave on the motorbike and I never saw him again, except in Parliament when the right were trying to put him in jail.
So it was a very difficult dilemma. So my heart, my soul said to me, go away. But my mind said to me that I had to find a solution, even though I knew that this solution was very, very difficult and tough.
And let's be clear why, because a Grexit would have involved the collapse of the economy.
The collapse, first of all, of banks, and then the collapse of the economy.
Tsipras was right to stay in power. But let's step back even further. On the night of the 62%, I was in the Maximo and I'm filming. They didn't expect to win, so they hadn't prepared. They didn't expect to win by a landslide, which is what they did. So they didn't prepare. But they could have said, right, we have 1 week to do a deal with Europe on equal terms. So we're going to mobilize our own masses. Instead, they disappeared. All the people who were going to do the deal disappeared. Literally, I was still phoning them, but then my access to that space fell. It never returned. And on the streets the next day, you could tell, because we have a hardline communist party in Greece, which is always prepared to believe that it's going to be betrayed. We have a betrayal mentality going back to the Varkisa Accord of 1944, when the Greek left gave its weapons to the British Army, and then the British Army installed the fascists. It's always going to be that narrative. To stop that narrative, they should have mobilized and said, we need you to do an honorable, decent deal. And they didn't do that. So people internalized the defeat narrative on the day after the referendum, and it took several more days to do for Schäuble to hit them.
Ποια συμφωνία? Μακάρι να μην γίνει, στο έχω πει. Μακάρι να φύγουμε από την Ευρώπη. Μακάρι. 100.000 φορές. Να πει ο Τσίπρας, φεύγω, αποχωρώ. Μπορεί να το κάνει. Μακάρι. Και έχω 2 παιδιά. Θα σπάω την πέτρα εδώ και θα ζω. Δεν θα έχω αυτούς δίπλα να έχω το βούρδουλα. Βλέπεις γιατί δεν θέλω να ασχολούμαι με τις Βρυξέλλες. Αχ, να είχα έναν αποδάψει μπροστά, Βασίλε.
Εγώ 17 χρονών ήμουν στον Αντάρτικο, πολέμησα στο Ζεύο, τον Μπούστη. Το Τσίπρα να πας στο διάλογο. Να πας στο διάλογο, το κουκουένι. Οι κομμουνιστές θα που να μου πρίζουν από ελληνικό αίμα, το ξέρεις. Ελληνικό αίμα.
The other thing I would have done is internationalize the struggle. We have free movement. What's to stop them getting on a ferry? What's to stop 20,000 Greeks getting on a ferry, going to Brindisi, getting on a train and going to Brussels, and then the usual thing that Greek people do when they're protesting? To bring chaos to Brussels, Frankfurt and Berlin is all right if Brussels, Frankfurt and Berlin are destroying our social fabric. And I think, again, if there is a left government in Europe that really means business, it's going to have to find physical, material, moral and cultural ways to place pressure on what is left of the elite in the centre, that is Brussels, Berlin, Frankfurt.
La sensación que yo tuve en aquellos meses, recuerdo algunas conversaciones con Alexis Tsipras en las que yo le explicaba: el Partido Socialista no quiere gobernar con nosotros, por lo tanto veo muy difícil un cambio de gobierno en una dirección progresista, porque no quieren y porque las élites económicas españolas trabajan para que nosotros no entremos en ese gobierno. Al mismo tiempo, como señalabas tú, Hollande y Renzi se quitaron de en medio en la pelea y parecía muy difícil imaginar que pudiera haber movilizaciones decisivas en más de un país, digamos, con unos poderes mediáticos que estaban trabajando claramente en contra del gobierno griego. La pregunta es, como asesor y como británico, que en esto los británicos tenéis más afilada la mente, ¿cuál crees que sería la estrategia más eficaz para poner en dificultades a las élites europeas que estaban tomando las decisiones? Si no había gobiernos que compensaran y si era muy difícil hacer una movilización transnacional que afectara realmente a esas élites.
Look, I don't think that it may be that for 2015 the outcome was the only logical outcome because at the time there was no way of putting pressure on Hollande, Renzi likewise, but now both Hollande and Renzi and their successors have seen what happens as a result of betraying Greece, that the social democratic culture and political culture of Europe is collapsing because people identify it with the status quo. So the answer to the question, I think, is better answered, what do we do next time? Look, let's hit head on the issue. I don't think Pedro Sanchez is my greatest fan, but I am a fan of him because he had the courage to break with the bureaucracy and a little bit, but he had the courage when he stepped away from the leadership, went to the people, and reset the PSOE's view so that now it is permissible for them to form a government supported by Podemos. It was impermissible for PASOK to form a government supported by Syriza, although Syriza would have done this. They wouldn't have done what you have done, but they could have made moves in advance. So now, we have to be honest with the European liberal centrist elite. We have to say to them, the system you created failed. Do you accept that? Most of them still don't. I'm surrounded inside the British, not just the Labour Party, but the media, people who have been to the great universities. They cannot accept that the 30-year free market period is over. So we have to have that argument with them. To the ones who then accept it, we say, actually, I spent 30 years fighting neoliberalism. You are no longer the main enemy. The main enemy is nationalist neoliberalism. I call it Thatcherism in one country, which is Orban, law and justice in Poland, Kurz in Austria, with his lean to the fascists. Let's fight them. Let's fight them together. Right now in Britain, among the intelligentsia, this is the argument we, the left, are having. It's coming. The Bolsonaro movement might come all across Europe. And at that moment, you must stop calling us fascists and actually decide to fight the real fascists. This is what's happening. So what we can do on the left is to create two things: an ideological argument that explains to the mass of people that there is a solution, there is an alternative to neoliberalism, and to the neoliberals a tactical and even a strategic offer. Together, let's fight to save democracy, save global multilateralist institutions, and the liberal social values which so many young people take for granted, but which these right-wingers will come and attack: the rights of women, the rights of minorities, the rights of gays. They are all going to be under attack if the right win. So we, the liberal centrists, and us, the left, have a common interest, just as in 1936 here in this country, a common interest in fighting a common enemy.
El debate sobre nuestra guerra me gustaría tenerlo en otro momento, porque yo creo que es fascinante también para entender las correlaciones de fuerza tanto a nivel estatal como a nivel internacional, que fueron absolutamente determinantes. Digamos, en España se enfrentó el bloque de poder oligárquico, sostenido por los británicos, sostenido al final también por los franceses, y el miedo al comunismo, digamos, construyó la victoria sobre los sectores democráticos que, al estar hegemonizados por las organizaciones de la clase obrera, digamos, proyectaban un futuro muy interesante, pero al mismo tiempo eso les debilitaba en la correlación de fuerzas a nivel internacional. Volviendo a Grecia y a España, yo siempre me he enfadado mucho con los compañeros que decían Tsipras es un traidor. Como la política no tiene que ver con el programa de gobierno, no tiene que ver con la radicalidad de la camiseta, tiene que ver con cómo actuar en una correlación de fuerzas muy difícil. Y nosotros siempre hemos defendido que el gobierno griego no tenía muchas más opciones que fueran asumibles además para el pueblo griego, porque hay veces que las opciones de los revolucionarios no son las opciones de la gente que quiere cosas mucho más sencillas. En la estrategia nuestra con Pedro Sánchez, para nosotros ha sido clave explicarle lo que está ocurriendo en Italia y decir, Italia es una expresión de la crisis europea con un gobierno xenófobo, pero que al mismo tiempo hace un planteamiento soberanista que desafía, digamos, ciertos elementos de la gobernanza europea. Decimos, Salvini es hijo de Merkel. Por lo tanto, la única manera de salvar Europa es que desde la península ibérica, un poquito desde Portugal y un poco más fuerte desde España, pueda llegar un modelo neokeynesiano, un modelo de resistencia al neoliberalismo, de protección de los derechos sociales y de mejora de la demanda interna, como modelo español que diga Europa puede ser otra cosa. Pero claro, esto implica un cambio en la estrategia de los socialdemócratas. Esto implica que definitivamente digan que no a Schroeder, digan que no a Tony Blair, digan que no a lo que hizo el Partido Socialista francés, y eso es enormemente complicado, no solamente porque los socialistas o su partido son lo que son, sino porque tampoco parece claro que haya élites europeas dispuestas incluso a aceptar algo tan moderado como un gobierno del Partido Socialista con nosotros. A nosotros nos consta que tanto en Europa como en las élites económicas españolas van a disparar con toda su munición política, económica y mediática para que nosotros no formemos parte de un gobierno, a pesar de que nuestras propuestas programáticas son enormemente modestas y moderadas.
I think that we are, if you're right, then we are going to see the collapse of neoliberalism in a national direction. Because my fear, quite soon, actually, in the next year's European elections, is that the right and far right could win. Then what the Commission looks like is very different, and what the European Parliament looks like. Just at the moment it gets some sovereignty, it's full of nationalists, xenophobes, misogynists, and right-wingers. That will destroy Europe. Now, I think there is a European elite which is around the banking sector in Germany and France, which is around, and Spain, which is around the automotive sector, which is around the business services like the Accenture and the Deloitte. That is where the elite is in Europe. Actually, the interesting thing is we don't have a Silicon Valley, we don't have a Zuckerberg, we don't have ultra-liberal West Coast type capitalism. Now, they have a material interest in maintaining the multilateral system. It is under attack from where? From Trump. Trump wants to rip it apart and turn Europe into a kind of colonial, I use this word metaphorically, a kind of colonial economic system, all focused towards the United States. So they have a Europeanist interest in making the whole thing work. Now, when I travel across Europe speaking to left parties and left politicians, they ask me often, they look at Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, of which I'm a member, and they say, how did you get 500,000 people to join? The answer is, we never had a copy of the Lisbon Treaty in our head. We always assumed that everything we were going to do would be done under our own sovereignty. And if Lisbon or the Maastricht criteria prevent it, we'll fight. Because we had a semi-detached relationship to Brussels anyway. Now, I think the left in Europe, including yourself, including Sanchez, have to, I always say this, rip up the copy of the Lisbon Treaty that's in your head and imagine a new treaty. But here's the problem. I personally don't think we're going to get there with all 27 states, because I don't believe there is a political culture in some East European countries to accept that. When Tsipras, I spoke to the Syriza last year, what's the program going forward? They want to equalize welfare benefits so that the Greek minimum wage rises, that the welfare state rises in Greece, and of course there is fiscal transfer from the north to pay for it. The opponents there are not just Germany and the Netherlands. The opponents are Estonia, Lithuania, Poland. You know, Eastern Europe is the biggest bloc to a socially just Europe right now. And given we only have one life, and I want to see this achieved in my lifetime, I'd be very happy to see the East European states that don't want social justice left behind and see how they like being the new buffer zone with Vladimir Putin. They won't.
Te quiero preguntar por el Reino Unido, por dos direcciones contradictorias que me tienen muy desasosegado. Por una parte, el Brexit implica algo que redefine las condiciones de posibilidad de la Unión Europea. De Gaulle nunca hubiera aceptado a un portaaviones de los Estados Unidos como el Reino Unido en la Unión Europea. De hecho, Reino Unido siempre defendió la ampliación de la Unión Europea al este para destruir las potencialidades políticas de la Unión. Eso, digamos, tiene un punto de corte con el Brexit. Hay una Europa que se puede volver a plantear la necesidad de un ejército europeo, quizá independiente de la OTAN, y la necesidad de tener unas relaciones con Rusia propias que no dependan de los Estados Unidos, teniendo a los británicos más lejos. Pero el segundo proceso del Reino Unido, que es fascinante, es que por fin puede haber un primer ministro de izquierdas en la historia del Reino Unido. Jeremy Corbyn no es cualquier cosa. Los gobiernos laboristas en el Reino Unido han sido muy conservadores en su política exterior, incluso utilizando una expresión antigua, muy imperialistas. Corbyn, sin embargo, expresa una tradición política que nunca ha tenido un primer ministro y puede ser el primer ministro. ¿Qué rol crees que está llamado en la escena europea e internacional un Reino Unido en el que Jeremy Corbyn fuera primer ministro?
Okay, the first thing is that it still may be that Brexit fails, that the deal that has been done does not pass the British Parliament, and then we are most likely going to have weeks of political chaos. At the end of that period, I hope there will be an election and that Labour will form a government either on its own or with the relatively progressive nationalist parties of Scotland and Wales. Now, in that situation, actually, the question then arises, do we go ahead with Brexit? The problem we have is that Brexit is driven by two things. It's driven by a right-wing xenophobic feeling among, and I'm sorry to say it's rooted in the very areas that I come from, the same as it is in France and Germany, old industrial areas, where if you don't have class politics, all you have is ethnicity.
Absolutely.
That we are in conflict with. But the good thing is that that's not the only thing that drove Brexit. There was a legitimate, you know, I heard many people say, look what they did to Greece. There is a legitimate question of extreme neoliberalism, Europe as the transmitter of extreme neoliberalism, with, of course, very little sovereignty. If you want to save your local steelworks, because it's the only employer, this is a concrete situation in South Wales, the biggest steelworks in Western Europe almost, could die at any minute. And what we want to be able to do is to save it. And the first time we really moved to save it, giving state aid or subsidy, we've got Brussels, or we've got multinational companies lobbying Brussels to close it down. We want some sovereignty over what the industrial strategy of Britain needs to be. And some people who voted for Brexit for that reason are the people who vote Labour. Of course, some xenophobes also vote Labour. So we refused to become the party of Remain. If we wanted to be the party of Remain, we would be hegemonic in every city with coffee bars and internet and people with tattoos and nose rings, but we would lose the working class. So we said, we're going to try and do Brexit in a socially just way, and that's where we are right now. Now, in other words, if Corbyn were to become Prime Minister and, for example, do a deal that looks a bit like Norway, is that a disaster for Britain? No. But then it poses the question for Europe, as you rightly point out. Corbyn is not an Atlanticist politician. And, however, British Labour is not Corbyn. Even me, as a leftist from the Trotskyist and autonomist tradition, I am not such a big fan of Vladimir Putin or Venezuela, okay? And I would see the foreign policy of Britain would be like this. It would my own personal position is embrace NATO, keep the nuclear weapons, but what's the reason? To maintain, Britain of course is an imperial power, ex-imperial power, to maintain our strength, to be able to then say to NATO, no more wars of intervention. And on the nuclear side, to provoke a rapid and aggressive multilateral negotiation that junks these warheads forever. A big nuclear power with a leftist government can do a lot of good, and it has to do it, I would argue, by engaging with the existing system, not by in some way kind of becoming a kind of maverick power. That is the fear of the Europeans, that Britain is going to kind of spin away into a kind of anti-imperialist I don't think it's going to do that. But I do think Europe needs to consolidate, with or without Britain, Europe needs to consolidate a liberal democratic project. And if that means having an army, fine. I don't think it should have a gendarmerie battalion. I think it should disband this. I think in Greece, you remember, every week there was a rumor, the battalion has arrived, we've been invaded. Let's get rid of that. But let's have common European security and foreign policy. And another social democratic politician who I suspect she is not my fan, but I am her fan, Mogherini. I think she has templated how Europe could do great in the world. And through the Iran deal, it's no accident that Trump attacked the Iran deal, because this is the greatest achievement of Mogherini and liberal Europe.
Te quiero preguntar por tu libro. Hay una cosa fascinante que es post. Hay vida, hay algo después del capitalismo. No es una cuestión menor. Slavoj Žižek ha dicho que hemos visto en muchas películas el apocalipsis, el fin de la humanidad, la llegada de los extraterrestres, pero nunca hemos visto una película que nos hable del fin del capitalismo y su sustitución o su evolución hacia un sistema económico distinto. En este libro tú lo planteas como una opción viable y cercana. ¿Cómo explicarías, digamos, este corte epistemológico tan fuerte? ¿Cómo se le puede hablar a la gente de que podría haber, y no tan lejos, un sistema económico distinto?
Okay, we live in a time of technological euphoria, but socio-economic doom. I meet business leaders who can explain to me 10 to 15 years of technological pipeline coming down the road, but believe their own country is going to be fascist within 5 years. Okay, so the book said these two crises are linked. We can't treat the technological advance that we're living through as something separate from the socio-economic disruption. In fact, going back to Marx in the Grundrisse, Marx explains that if we ever get to a situation where technology allows human beings to, as he says, step to the side of producing things and watch and manage an automatic process, then this will be a profound challenge to capitalism itself. Why? Because capitalism is based, first of all, on scarcity. The reason cappuccino is $2.99 and a latte is $3, whatever, is because milk and coffee are scarce. But information is not scarce. And in fact, the collapsing cost of production of information is now affecting real things. If you look at an aircraft, the engineers who at the start of their career worked out with calculators and slide rules 12 variants of the stress load on an aircraft's body frame. Now you do 186 million virtual flights of the same aircraft. So information technology is just not about information, it's about a revolutionizing of the cost of production of real things. This creates a path beyond scarcity for many things. If I walk out of this studio with this mug, your security guard is not going to chase me down the road, because the mugs are abundant. They're a penny. Yeah? We can make a lot of things become as cheap as this through information technology. And when we do, we have a choice. Do we carry on working 8 hours a day, or do we reduce the amount of work in society? Well, a society with relative abundance and very little work can't be a capitalist society. So the point is to imagine a transition beyond it. And the frustration I had, I'm surrounded by very progressive people modeling the climate transition. How do we get rid of carbon? How do we go green in energy? How do we create circularity so that we no longer use the Earth's raw materials? But when you ask them to imagine a world without capitalism, it's like you've gone crazy. But the purpose of the book was to say specifically to the left, and specifically to the left that's oriented to government, you can do something about this. Because in Germany and here in Spain, in Catalonia, as documented by Manuel Castells, during the crisis, lots of alternative, non-capitalist, post-capitalist forms of economics are brought into existence by the crisis. Time banks, food banks, seed banks, cooperatives, credit unions. You have Mondragon, the biggest cooperative. But the role of the state in this transition is to manage it and organize it. And that's where the anarchists go, okay, we can do it from below. I say no. The reason I describe myself as a radical social democrat is that I want to bring a mixture of, in a way, the anarchist unautonomist economics of peer-to-peer and the commons, the statism of the radical left, creating welfarism, the class struggle of the radical left as well. It is a fight, it's not an evolution. With social democracy's capability to manage big change. And I think if we bring together a left that does all those three things, and a green element and a feminist element, we have a very attractive political proposition for the 21st century. But to do it, can't be done like in an airport. You go to an airport, you buy a book about the future. It says, technology is going to make the future beautiful. I say the technological change has made the present ugly. We're surrounded by monopolies. We're surrounded by Facebook, predatory actions against our minds. In election time, it's trying to control what we think and do. So this is not kind of some science fiction book. It's about how we address the crisis of capitalism now with politics and economics that are not just nostalgia for the 1970s and 80s.
Estamos llegando al final, llegamos a la rueda de reconocimiento. Yo señalo algunos nombres propios y en 2 o 3 frases los defines. El primero, okay. Winston Churchill.
Winston Churchill was a failure his entire life and a racist, until he realized that British imperialism was going to lose its empire unless he made an alliance with the British working class to win the war. And we have to acknowledge the heroic moment that was, even though we, the Labour movement, destroyed him 4 years later in an election where he called us Gestapo. We won. Yeah, that one heroic moment deserves to be celebrated, and the movie that celebrates it is a good movie.
Margaret Thatcher.
Margaret Thatcher destroyed the society I grew up in. She did it vindictively. I once saw her. I'm ashamed to say that I heckled Margaret Thatcher at an election meeting in 1983 after the Malvinas War. And I was surrounded by security guards and then went away. But because at the time I had very short hair, she came past me in a coach. And because I had short hair, she assumed that I was a soldier. And I shouted, "Las Malvinas are Argentinas." And her eyes went crazy. So that's my memory of Margaret Thatcher. I'm really glad that I annoyed her for 1 second.
Tony Blair.
Tony Blair understood something we should all understand, that the class dynamics of the old society had gone once Thatcher destroyed them. Thatcher created Blair as the solution to that. But I recognize one thing about Blair. He understood that for now, the forces were not there to fight neoliberalism. So what New Labour created was a survival kit. The survival kit worked as long as financial trickle-down worked. But once the finance system blew up, it was always going to stop. But Blair's great mistake was Iraq. 600,000 civilian deaths on the lie have to stay with you. And I think that his failure to acknowledge what he did wrong remains the stain that we carry around. As Labour people, we will still knock on doors, and there are people whose relatives died, English soldiers, British soldiers, who died in that war, needlessly, I would argue, who are still very angry with us.
Ralph Miliband.
Ralph Miliband was, of course, the father of Ed Miliband and David Miliband, the two sides of our party. Ralph Miliband understood something about the state, that the capitalist state is, in a way, a battleground itself. And I think the ghost of Ralph Miliband will be with people like me and Corbyn if we get into power, that we have this phrase in English, in and against the state. And Miliband, in a debate with a Greek Marxist called Nikos Poulantzas, which the book is an old 1960s book, it's suddenly become relevant. Can we use the state, and what does the state look like as a battlefield? That's what Miliband taught, well, the generation before me.
Theresa May.
Theresa May is a classic empty vessel, like an empty tin can. She was a Thatcherite under Thatcher. She was a Cameronite under Cameron. Brexit, she becomes a Brexiteer. She has, I would argue, zero talent for leadership and has catastrophically wasted 2 years, leading to with the hope that if you only give people a month to decide something, they will obey you. In a way, she's using the strategy that the European Commission and the Troika used against Greece, against the British people. And I think history will judge her very harshly for this, because she is a liberal, centrist, right-wing conservative. She did bad things to our own ethnic minorities, but also some Labour people did the same, you know, terrible racist rhetoric. In the end, she believed in Europe, but she couldn't bring herself to construct a party coalition to deliver a soft Brexit, so we have a catastrophic Brexit instead.
Jeremy Corbyn.
I think I've met Jeremy Corbyn 4 times, and yet every time I go on the British media, I am seen as his proxy. I am the Corbyn guy. There has to be a frame that says, danger, Corbyn. Corbyn, I support for one reason only, because he was able to go to places like the European Parliament to speak to the Social Democrats, and he said exactly as I said, neoliberalism is broken. We're not going to reform it. We're going to replace neoliberalism with a completely new form of capitalism that is socially just, green, and internationalist, and and anti-racist. This is Corbyn. Corbyn's ability to inspire 500,000 people to join a party that everybody else in Europe is seeing collapse, social democracy, comes from his genuineness. And this is the other thing. He's not a, you and Tsipras on the platform, it's wow. Corbyn, it's a little wow, yeah? But that's not, the important thing is when he meets people. And every selfie is seen by 100 other people. And when they say, what was he like? They always say, genuine.
Estamos llegando ya casi al final, nos queda solamente el cuestionario, esto es casi telegráfico. ¿Quién ha sido un maestro o una maestra política para ti?
My political teacher was a Trotskyist activist called David Hughes, and he taught me to think critically. He died just after the Yeltsin government came to power. He was a Russian expert and taught me so much about Russian Revolution, Soviet Union. But yeah, I still think that I owe a lot to him.
¿Un libro que recomendarías leer a todos los dirigentes políticos de izquierdas en Europa?
Vasily Grossman, Life and Fate.
¿Una película?
Casablanca. Because we're in the Casablanca moment. We have to persuade the Vichy policeman to join the Spanish Civil War veteran to fight the right.
Y cantar la Marsellesa.
And the Internationale.
Y por último, una canción.
A song. You know, in Fidelio, Beethoven's Fidelio, there is this song where the man is in the prison and he says, even if I die here, I did my duty. I'm sorry to say, even right now in Europe, but certainly in Turkey, in Egypt, and in the other countries, soon in Bolsonaro's Brazil, there will be people in jail who've gone through the exact same thing. And it was already experienced 200 years ago by Beethoven. So that song, the Florestanzo aria.
Ya solamente me queda pedirte que cojas con la mano izquierda la taza de la tuerca y mirando a esa cámara brindes por lo que quieras.
I will use Trotsky's phrase, to the clear, bright future of humankind.
Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias.
It was good.
Good.
Ich murre nicht, Das Masterland